Chapter 11 of Epochs of American History, The Colonists, 1492 to 1750, by Reuben Thwaites. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Other English North American colonies, 1605 to 1750. 98 references. See text. 99 outlying English colonies. It is usual to think and speak of the English colonies in North America as though they included only the 13 which in 1775 revolted against the mother country. In the eyes of the home government, however, and of the colonists themselves, the relations between the motherland and the English West India Islands, the Bermudas, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Hudson's Bay, and after 1763 Canada, were much the same as between it and Virginia, or New Hampshire, or Pennsylvania. The chief differences between the colonies were of race and occupation. Nova Scotia had before the Revolution but a few thousand English inhabitants. The West Indies were almost exclusively sugar-producing colonies. Both on the north and on the southeast, the English colonies touched elbows with the French in active commercial and territorial competition. The West Indies were the emporium for sugar and slaves, and an extensive traffic was had in both commodities with the continental colonies. This important commerce has already been frequently referred to, particularly in the treatment of New England, whose vessels did the bulk of the colonial carrying trade. Various causes conspired to prevent Englishmen in these outlying plantations from joining their brethren of New England, the Middle Colonies, and the South in the movement for independence. The West India planters were largely aided by English capital, and in England, where many of them had summer residences, they enjoyed a profitable and exclusive market for sugar, cotton, and other tropical products. It was considered good policy by English statesmen to favor the island colonies as against the continental, for the products of the former did not compete with those of Great Britain, so that while the Navigation Acts restricting all colonial trade to British ports at first bore heavily on the island planters, they were compensated in part by numerous discriminations in their favor. Many of these planters were the sons of cavaliers who had fled to the islands of the Caribbean Sea to escape from the rule of the Commonwealth, or wealthy men who had, in times of popular disturbance, been made to feel uncomfortable in their old homes on the American mainland. In Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, the ports were filled with English traders and officers, and a great belt of untraversed forest separated them from the New Englanders with whom they had little in common. But perhaps above all was the fact that His Majesty's fleet easily commanded these outlying colonies, and revolt was not to be thought of within the reach of the guns of ships. It is worth our while briefly to review the history of these British-American dependencies, which for one reason or another did not enter the struggle that was soon to rend the empire in twain at the moment it had reached its greatest extent. 100 Windward and Leeward Islands, 1605 to 1814. Barbados. The easternmost of the Windward Islands was first visited by a party of English adventurers in 1605, since which time it has been an English possession. But it was not until 1625 that a colony was planted on the island. Its plan of government was much the same as that of the mainland colonies. During the Puritan uprising in England, Barbados was a place of refuge for loyalists who were disposed till the appearance of a parliamentary force, 1651, to hold the island for the king. Under Cromwell's rule, many prisoners of war were sent to the island, thus increasing the royalist population. The Restoration was promptly proclaimed. The colony made rapid progress, although now and then checked by the fact that its exposed position made it in time of war a favorite point of attack by enemies of England. The numerous harbors along the coast were, in such troublous periods, infested by privateers who seriously interfered with the commerce of the island. In the war between Great Britain and France, commencing in 1756, the West Indies was the theatre of a prolonged conflict into which the Barbadians entered with zeal, supplying money and troops to the English side, and oftentimes suffering from reverses. Before the Navigation Acts, by which England sought to compel all her colonists to trade with her alone, the Dutch were good customers for Barbados sugar. After that, English merchants having a monopoly of the traffic, the planters had much reason to complain. Nevertheless, the majority were stanch Tories and remained so throughout the Revolutionary War. Many Barbadians settled from time to time upon the mainland, particularly in the Carolinas. We have seen that Sir John Yeamans, a Barbados planter, led several hundred of his fellow islanders thither 1664, and founded a town on Cape Fear River. St. Vincent, 100 miles west of Barbados, although discovered by Columbus in 1498, was unclaimed until 1627, when it was granted to the Earl of Carlisle by Charles I, along with others of the Windward group. In 1722, the Duke of Montagu came into possession of it, and then immigrants were introduced to exported sugar, rum, molasses, and arrowroot. St. Lucia was settled by the English in 1639. Its ownership was long passed back and forth by France and England, but in 1794 the latter secured permanent possession. The English flag was raised over Tobago in 1580, but the island was alternately held by English and Dutch until 1814, since which date the proprietorship of the former has been undisputed. Grenada and the Grenadines, colonized by the French, first came into English possession under the Treaty of 1763. Trinidad, the southernmost of the chain of islands, and one of the most valuable, was occupied by the Spanish until 1797, when it was yielded up to Great Britain under show of force. Today it is one of the most progressive of the smaller English dependencies. Upon the leeward or northern islands of the Caribbean group are the colonies of Antigua, Montserrat, St. Christopher, St. Kitts, Nevis, Dominica, and the Virgin Islands. Antigua, the seat of the present colonial government, is the most important. English families settled there in 1632 and again in 1663. Ravaged by France 3 years later, 1666, it was soon after restored to the English under the Treaty of Breda. Montserrat, the healthiest island in the West Indies, was also colonized by the English in 1632 and remained in their possession except for 2 brief terms, 1664 to 1668 and 1782 to 1784, when the French were in control. St. Christopher and Nevis form a united English colony which traces its history back to 1628. Dutch buccaneers entrenched themselves on the rocky islets of the Virgin Group as early as 1648, but were driven out by English pirates in 1666, since which date the archipelago has been the property of Great Britain. A better class of settlers came in with the 18th century. Dominica, the largest of the Leeward Islands, was included in Carlisle's patent 1627, but the French were already in possession, living on friendly terms with the native Caribs, just as their compatriots in New France were with the more warlike Algonquins. Ceded by France to England in 1763, Dominica was several times recaptured and not finally relinquished to the latter until 1814. 101. Bermudas, 1609 to 1750, and Bahamas, 1522 to 1783. The fertile Bermudas, or Somers Islands, still vexed Bermuthus of Shakespeare, lie about 600 miles east of South Carolina. They bear the names of 2 navigators who were cast away upon them, Juan Bermudez, a Spaniard, 1522, and an Englishman, Sir George Somers, 1609, the latter being on his way to Virginia to administer the affairs of that colony. Somers founded the first settlement. Under the third patent to the Virginia Company in 1612, the Bermudas and all islands within 300 leagues of the Virginia shore were ceded to that corporation. Except Nova Scotia, therefore, the Bermudas are the only present English colony which ever formed an integral part of any of the present states or territories of the United States. The Virginia Company, afterwards 1616, parted with its right to the Bermuda Company, which carried thither a considerable company of Virginians. During the Commonwealth, the Bermudas, like Barbados, were a refuge for royalists from England. Representative government, similar to that of the mainland colonies, was established in 1620 and has been ever since maintained. Tobacco was the staple of the colony until about 1707, when a salt-making industry sprang up and soon became the chief interest. The Bermudas were from the earliest times recognized as an important marine station. During the Revolutionary War, Washington wrote, "Let us annex the Bermudas and thus possess a nest of hornets to annoy the British trade." But the place was undisturbed and remained loyal to the king. The first American soil trod by Columbus was an island in the fruitful Bahama group. "This country," he wrote, "excels all others as far as the day surpasses the night in splendor." The natives were numerous. Their conversation is the sweetest imaginable. Their faces always smiling, and so gentle and so affectionate are they that I swear to your highness there is not a better people in the world. Yet, commencing in 1509, the Spaniards almost depopulated the islands. 40,000 of these innocent aborigines were carried away to a wretched death in the mines of Cuba. In 1629, an English colony was planted on New Providence in the then deserted archipelago, but the French and Spanish persisted in harrying the settlement, which was frequently the scene of stormy conflicts. At last, in 1718, the English government drove out the pirates who had come to resort there in great numbers, resettled the islands, and an era of progress opened. During the Revolutionary War, many wealthy Tories went from the continental colonies to the Bahamas and opened up large plantations with slave labor. The colony was captured by the Americans 1776, the only conquest of British territory during the Revolution except the Canadian campaign of 1775 and the occupation of the Northwest by Virginia troops in 1778. The Spanish took it in 1782, but it was soon retaken by the English 1783. Three-quarters of a century later, the islands became famous as the point of departure for blockade runners bound into Confederate ports. 102. Jamaica, 1655 to 1750. Jamaica was under Spanish control until 1655, when an English fleet under Admirals Penn and Venables, the former father of the founder of Pennsylvania, compelled the surrender of the island to the Commonwealth. The opposition of the Spanish planters and their Negro slaves, the latter were called Maroons, long made English government difficult. The Spaniards were finally driven off, but the Maroons, fleeing to the mountains, were troublesome until the close of the 18th century. Much annoyance was also suffered in the 17th century from the buccaneers, who infested the Jamaica coast and preyed indiscriminately on all West Indian commerce. They were suppressed with great difficulty. In 1728, English laws and statutes became applicable to the island. Like other islands in the West Indies, Jamaica was resorted to by many Tory planters from the continental colonies, and apparently had no sympathy with the struggle of the latter for independence. It was a colony having a large slave population, and after the separation of the continental colonies became to some degree a competitor with them. The abolition of slavery in the island, 1830 to 1837, had a great influence on the slavery conflict in the United States. 103. British Honduras, 1600 to 1798. Belize, or British Honduras, on the eastern shore of the Yucatan Peninsula, was not occupied by Englishmen until after the suppression of freebooting in the Spanish Main, about the opening of the 18th century. At that time, parties of English dye-wood and mahogany cutters, many of whom had been pirates, established themselves at Belize. Their holdings were frequently beset by rival Spanish logging companies, but in 1798 the latter were expelled. Since that day, Belize has existed as a prosperous crown colony, although England's legal right to the country is still questioned by some authorities, and in 1846 this fact gave rise to serious diplomatic difficulties with the United States. 104. Newfoundland, 1497 to 1783. Newfoundland is the oldest of the colonial possessions of Great Britain. We have seen that John Cabot discovered it in 1497, that Corderil was there for the Portuguese in 1500, and that by 1504 fishermen from Normandy, Brittany, and the Basque provinces were regularly engaged on its shores. It was the nucleus for both French and English occupation of the mainland, and from the first an important fishery station. Not until 1583 did the English take formal possession, and it was much later before any of their numerous colonizing schemes attained any great measure of success. By the Treaty of Utrecht, 1713, Newfoundland was acknowledged as English territory, but the French were given fishing privileges on the western and northern coasts. This led to diplomatic contentions not yet ended. Nevertheless, settlement at once increased, and a satisfactory growth has since been maintained. In 1728, a form of civil government was for the first time established. During the American Revolution, Newfoundland had sufficient inducement to remain loyal. Since French and American competitors in the fisheries were kept out by British fleets, her merchants had a monopoly of the European markets and were enabled to maintain high prices. 105. Nova Scotia, Acadia, 1497 to 1755. First visited by the Cabots in 1497, it was not until 1604 that European colonization was attempted in Nova Scotia under the Frenchman de Monts. In 1613, the Virginia privateer Argall, basing his excuse on Cabot's previous discovery, swooped down on the French settlements, demolished the cabins, and expelled the inhabitants. A grant of the peninsula called Acadia by the French, but in this document styled Nova Scotia by the king, was made by James I to Sir William Alexander. The latter was, however, prevented by the French, 1623, from carrying out his colonizing scheme. Nevertheless, several Englishmen and Scotchmen came into the country and mingled with the French, who were slowly repopulating it. Recaptured by an English force in 1654, Nova Scotia was, 13 years later, 1667, ceded to France. But the ease of communication by water made the colony an uncomfortably close neighbor for the English colonies farther south. In 1710, the Massachusetts men captured Port Royal, and in 1713 France relinquished possession to England by the Treaty of Utrecht. Again in 1745, Massachusetts volunteers captured Louisbourg on Cape Breton. England paid little attention to Nova Scotia until 1749, when 4,000 emigrants were sent over to found Halifax. The French settlers, known as Acadians, had meanwhile become numerous and greatly abused their privileges as neutrals by fostering and joining Indian war parties against the New England settlers. In 1755, the Acadians were easily reduced by General Monckton, and 7,000 transported to the British provinces southward, many of them finally drifting to the French settlement at the mouth of the Mississippi. A colonial constitution of the regulation English pattern was granted to Nova Scotia in 1758, and France formally released her claim by the Treaty of 1763. At the same time, Cape Breton, which had been a second time captured, 1758, was added. The Englishmen in Nova Scotia were largely of the official and trading class, having little in common with their neighbors of the more southern colonies. In the Revolution, several thousand Loyalist refugees found an asylum in the peninsula. For the remaining French colony, Canada, special treatment will be necessary. 106. Hudson's Bay Company. The Hudson's Bay Company, from the time it was chartered by Charles II, 1670, until its lands were sold to the British government, 1869, was a joint stock association with exclusive commercial and political privileges, very similar to the Company of Massachusetts Bay. Today it trades as a private corporation. Its former territory, the lands draining into Hudson's Bay, is now open to all on equal terms. Fur trade factories, protected by strong forts, were early planted by the company at the mouths of several sub-Arctic rivers, such as the Rupert, Moore, Albany, Nelson, and Churchill, the only inhabitants being the small garrisons and the company's trading servants. Several expeditions were successively made to Hudson's Bay by French war vessels. Much devastation was wrought and blood spilled until, in 1697, the Treaty of Ryswick put an end to the trouble and left the company in undisputed possession. It had lost more than £200,000 in this predatory warfare, but soon regained its position through the profits of the fur trade. After the fall of New France, 1763, the Hudson's Bay Company met formidable rivals in the enterprising Northwestern American organizations. The story of the fierce competition which ensued with its effect on American settlement and international boundaries belongs to the period covered by other volumes of this series. From the foregoing sketch it will be seen that for all the American colonies to the south of Georgia, the English were obliged to fight a changeful battle with the Spaniards and the French. It was not till after the Revolutionary War that the permanent ownership of the islands was assured to Great Britain. A similar struggle, though briefer and sooner concluded, went on for the possession of the colonies north of Maine. But 12 years before the Revolution the last of them had been yielded to the British. In Nova Scotia and later in Canada, English residents were not numerous till the beginning of the 19th century. In Newfoundland and Hudson's Bay in colonial times, the settlers were English, but in numbers they were few. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Epochs of American History, The Colonists, 1492 to 1750, by Reuben Thwaites. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Colonization of New France, 1608 to 1750. 107. References. See text. 108. Settlement of Canada, 1608 to 1629. The story of early French efforts at colonization in North America, from Cartier's visit 1534 to Champlain's foundation of Quebec 1608, the first permanent French colony in Canada, has already been told. It was unfortunate for New France that Champlain occurred at the outset. The hostility of the Iroquois, the French, and the Algonquin tribes with whom they maintained friendly relations were long after sorely afflicted by them. Had it not been for the Iroquois wall interposed between Champlain and the south, the French would doubtless have preceded the English upon the Atlantic plain. The presence of this opposition led the founder of New France, in his attempts to extend the sphere of French influence, to explore along the line of least resistance to the north and west. In 1611, Montreal was planted at the first rapids in the St. Lawrence and near the mouths of the Ottawa and Richelieu. 4 years later, 1615, Champlain reached Lake Huron by the way of the Ottawa. There were easier highways to the northwest, but the French were compelled for many years thereafter to take this path because of its greater security from the all-devouring Iroquois. To extend the sphere of French influence and the Catholic religion, as well as to induce the savages to patronize French commerce, were objects which inspired both lay and clerical followers of Champlain. Their wonderful zeal illumined the history of New France with a poetic glamour such as is cast over no other part of America north of Mexico. Under Champlain's guidance and inspired by his example, traders and priests soon penetrated to the far west, the former bent on trafficking for peltries and the latter on saving souls. Another large class of rovers, styled coureurs de bois, or wood rangers, wandered far and wide, visiting and fraternizing with remote tribes of Indians. They were attracted by the love of lawless adventure and conducted an extensive but illicit fur trade. Many of these explorers left no record of their journeys, hence it is now impossible to say who first made some of the most important geographical discoveries. 109. exploration of the Northwest, 1629 to 1699. We know that by 1629, the year before the planting of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Champlain saw an ingot of copper obtained by barter with Indians from the shores of Lake Superior. In 1634, Jean Nicolet, another emissary from Champlain, penetrated to central Wisconsin by way of the Fox River, and thence went overland to the Illinois country, making trading agreements with the savage tribes along his path. 7 years afterwards, 1641, Jesuit priests said Mass before 2,000 naked savages at Saint-Marie. In the winter of 1658 to 1659, two French fur traders, Radisson and Groseilliers, imbued with a desire to travel and see countries and to be known with the remotest people, visited Wisconsin, probably saw the Mississippi, and built a log fort on Chickamauga Bay of Lake Superior. During 1662, they discovered James's Bay to the far northeast and became impressed with the fur-trading capabilities of the Hudson's Bay region. Not receiving French support in their enterprise, they sold their services to England. On the strength of their discoveries, the Hudson's Bay Company was organized. 1670, Saint-Lusson took formal possession of the Northwest for the French king at Saint-Marie in 1671. 2 years later, 1673, Joliet and Marquette made their now famous trip over the Fox, Wisconsin waterway and rediscovered the Mississippi. Champlain died at Quebec in 1635, having extended the trade and dominion of France westward to Wisconsin by the Ottawa Highway. It remained for the fur trader La Salle, one of the most brilliant of American explorers, to add the Mississippi Valley to French territory, 1679 to 1682, his route being up the Great Lakes and via the Chicago, Illinois portage. It was 1699 before a French settlement was planted in Louisiana, Old Biloxi, and 1718 before New Orleans was founded. The central geographical fact to be remembered in connection with the history of New France is that the St. Lawrence and the chain of Great Lakes which serve as its feeders furnish a natural highway to the heart of the continent. It has been shown that the hostility of the Iroquois forced the French, in their earliest explorations westward, to take the northern or indirect route of the Ottawa River and caused Huron to be the first Great Lake discovered. Ontario, Superior, and Michigan being next unveiled in the order named. Erie, the last to be seen by whites, was known as early as 1640, but owing to Iroquois warriors blocking the way, was not navigated until 1669, except by coureur de bois seeking the New York fur markets. Thus, Frenchmen were familiar with the sites of Sault Ste. Marie, Mackinac, Ashland, Green Bay, Prairie du Chien, and Chicago before they had visited the site of Detroit, 1669. But that place came to be recognized after its settlement, 1701, as the most important strategic point in the western possessions of New France. The difference between the character of the English and French colonies in North America was great. Englishmen were content to sow and reap in a plodding fashion, extending their territorial bounds no faster than their settlements needed room for growth. Their acquaintance with the Indians did not, with the exception of the New York and Southern fur traders, extend beyond the tribes which touched their borders. They were possessed of remarkable vitality and a strong sense of political and commercial independence. 110. Social and political conditions. The rigor of the Canadian winter, the shortness of the summer season, and persistent annoyance from the Iroquois, who at times had carried their warfare to the very walls of the settlements, combined to make the lot of the French farmer on the St. Lawrence far from prosperous. During many of its early years, New France largely depended for food upon supplies brought out from the mother country. The fur trader experienced but little more personal danger than the agriculturalist who remained upon his narrow farm hold abutting on the St. Lawrence, while the fascination of the unbridled life of adventure led by the former, free from the restraints of church and society, was such as strongly appealed to young men of spirit. The trade of New France was farmed out to commercial companies and to favorites of the king and his autocratic colonial governors. Unlicensed traffic, such as was carried on by the coureur de bois, was looked upon as akin to smuggling, and harsh laws were promulgated against it. Nevertheless, the forests far into the continental interior were penetrated by gay adventurers conducting illicit barter with the red barbarians, while the agriculture of the colony languished. The river systems of the English coast colonies did not easily conduct to the interior, but the far-reaching waterways of New France were a continual invitation. Iroquois interests were bound up with the Dutch, and after them with the English. The better to improve their own position and to keep up prices, the Iroquois endeavored to prevent Algonquins of the upper lakes from trading with the Canadians. But French influence in the northwest was nevertheless strong. Colonial officials cajoled the Indians and plied them with presents, while the wandering traders and their employees dwelt in comparative harmony with the red men, were adopted into many of the tribes, and married squaws who reared in their forest villages an extensive half-breed progeny. The disposition of the French crown to interfere with the fur trade and to repress all commercial initiative not emanating from privileged circles was but an evidence of its general colonial policy. The colony on the St. Lawrence was made continually to feel the hand of the king. In contrast to the free town and county systems of the English, the people of New France had no voice in their government or in the appointment of their officials. Even in the most trivial affairs, they looked to the crown for action. The country was governed much like a province in France. It was divided, one for judicial purposes, into districts with a judge at the head of each, from whom there might be an appeal to the superior council. Within the districts were 2 seigneuries, or great estates. The seigneur held his land immediately from the king and parceled it out among his vassals. The habitants, or cultivators who paid him a small rent, patronized his shops and mills, and owed him certain feudal obligations. Upon the estates were 3 parishes, in which the curé and the captain of militia were the chief personages. The only public duties exercised by the habitants were in connection with parish affairs, and then the initiative was taken at Quebec, where resided the central authority vested in the governor, intendant, and council. In 1672, Frontenac attempted to set up in Canada an assembly of the 3 estates or orders, but Colbert, the king's prime minister, rebuked him and gave directions for a gradual restriction of all privileges of representation. It seems better that everyone should speak for himself and no one for all. The people were not permitted to think or act for themselves, and they did not covet the privilege. Without political training, they had no notion of what the English call political rights. Had King Louis XIV been a wise monarch, paternalism might not have been a disadvantage for a population of this sort, but the royal patronage of colonial enterprises was spasmodic, sometimes breaking out into extravagant aid, again remarkable for its penuriousness. There were several in the long roll of colonial governors who were men of commanding ability and well fitted under right conditions to make of New France a success, notably Champlain, 1622 to 1635, Frontenac, 1672 to 1682, and 1689 to 1698, and de Nonville, 1685 to 1689. But the times and the material at hand were against them. Official corruption ran riot, from the monopolists, who were the present favorites of the king, down to the military commander of the most distant forest trading station. Officials considered the public treasury and the resources of the colony as a source of individual profit. The priesthood held full sway. Little was done without the sanction of the hierarchy. The missionaries of the faith won laurels for bravery, self-denial, and hardihood under the most adverse circumstances, but the policy of the Church was too exclusive for the good of the colony. Huguenots driven from France by persecution were forbidden by the bishops to reside in Canada, and thus were compelled to contribute their brain and brawn to the upbuilding of the rival English settlements. Of all Frenchmen, these were the best adapted to the rearing of an industrial empire in the New World. 111. Intercolonial Wars, 1628 to 1697. In Champlain's time, while France was busy in crushing Protestant revolts at home, the settlements of Port Royal and Quebec, then wretched hamlets of a few dozen huts, each fell an easy prey to small English naval forces, 1628 to 1629. For a few months France did not hold 1 foot of ground in North America, but as peace had been declared between France and England before this conquest, the former received back all its possessions, including Acadia, Nova Scotia, and the island of Cape Breton. The inevitable struggle for the mastery of the continent was postponed, and Frenchmen held Canada for 4 generations longer. By the close of the 17th century, men of New France were ranging at will over much of the country beyond the mountains, with visions of empire as extensive as the continent. The French were not exploring and occupying the western country unwatched. English colonial statesmen understood from the first the import of the movement, and their alarm was frequently expressed in communications to the home government. While Charles II was a pensioner of Louis XIV, the royal intendant in Canada expressed the situation clearly when he urged Louis, 1666, to purchase New York, whereby he would have 2 entrances to Canada, and by which he would give to the French all the peltries of the north, of which the English share the profit by the communication which they have with the Iroquois by Manhattan and Orange. In 1687, Governor Dongan of New York warned the ministry at London, "If the French have all they pretend to have discovered in these parts, the King of England will not have 100 miles from the sea anywhere." With the accession of Protestant William and Mary, 1689, the Palatinate War broke out between England and France, and at once spread to America, where it was styled King William's War. The French had at that time colonies in the undefined region of Acadia, on Cape Breton, and along the north bank of the St. Lawrence as far up as Montreal. There were a few small stockades scattered at long intervals through the Illinois country, upon the banks of the upper Mississippi, at Checkmanagan Bay of Lake Superior, at Sault Ste. Marie, on the St. Joseph's River, and elsewhere, with here and there a lonely Jesuit mission and the movable camps of coureurs de bois. Elsewhere, north and west of the Atlantic plain, the grim solitude was broken only by bands of red savages who roved to and fro through the dark woodlands, intent on war or the chase. The population of New France in this wide region was not, in 1690, more than 12,000 against 100,000 in New England and New York. Had it not been for the help of her Indian allies, the military strength of many of her more important stations, and the fighting qualities of her commanders, aided by division in the councils of the English colonies, New France would from the first have made a feeble defense against the overpowering resources of her southern neighbors. King William's or Frontenac's War was costly to the colonists and resulted in no material advantage to either side. The French, under Governor Frontenac, conducted their operations with vigor. 3 winter expeditions, composed almost entirely of Indians, were sent out 1690 against the English frontier line, furiously attacking it at widely separated points, New York, New Hampshire, and Maine. In consequence of the alarm created by these raids, the first Colonial Congress was held at New York, 1690. A fleet commanded by Sir William Phipps, with 1,800 New England militiamen on board, captured Acadia and Port Royal that summer, but Acadia was retaken by the French the following season. During the 5 ensuing years, fighting was confined to bush-ranging along the New York and New England border. The struggle was without further incident until Newfoundland yielded to the French, 1696, and a party of French and Indians sacked the little village of Andover, Massachusetts, 1697, but 25 miles out of Boston. Later in the year came the Treaty of Ryswick, under which each belligerent recovered what he possessed at the outset of the war. 112 Frontier Wars, 1702 to 1748. After the Treaty of Ryswick, 1697, there was peace between England and France for 5 years. Then broke out what is known in America as Queen Anne's War, 1702 to 1713, and in Europe as the War of the Spanish Succession. The war originated in Europe, but one of England's objects in the struggle was to prevent the French from obtaining too firm a foothold in America. Much the same military operations as in King William's War were undertaken by both of the American opponents. 3 attempts were made by New England troops to recapture Acadia, 1704, 1707, and 1710, the last being successful. The Peace of Utrecht, 1713, recognized England's right to Acadia with its ancient boundaries, but it brought only nominal peace to the New York and New England colonists. Unfortunately, the northern and western boundaries of Acadia were not therein fixed, and the country between the Kennebec and the St. Lawrence was in as much dispute as ever. Border settlers all along the line, from the Hudson to the Kennebec, were in hourly peril of their lives from Indian scalping parties. There was abundant proof that the authorities of New France, instructed by the government at Paris, were actively inciting the red savages to forays for scalps and plunder. This fact tended greatly to embitter the relations between the rival white races and led to measures of reprisal. The irregular War of the Austrian Succession, when it extended to America, was known as King George's War, 1744 to 1748. The principal event was the capture, 1744, by New England troops of the strong fortress of Louisburg on the island of Cape Breton. Having achieved so heroic a victory almost single-handed, New Englanders considered themselves slighted by the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, 1748, by which Louisburg was surrendered to France, and in other respects the unfortunate state of affairs existing before the war was restored. Disappointment was openly expressed and tended still further to strain the relations between the colonies and the motherland. 113 territorial claims. An attempt had been made at the convention at Aix-la-Chapelle to settle the boundary disputes in America by referring the matter to a commission. France now asserted her right to all countries drained by streams emptying into the St. Lawrence, the Great Lakes, and the Mississippi. This allowed the narrow strip of the Atlantic coast would alone have been left to English domination. It was asserted on behalf of Great Britain that the charters of her coast colonies carried their western bounds to the Pacific. Further, that, as by the Treaty of Utrecht, France had acknowledged the suzerainty of the British king over the Iroquois Confederacy, the English were entitled to all lands conquered by those Indians whose warpaths had extended from the Ottawa River on the north to the Carolinas on the south, and whose forays reached alike to the Mississippi and to New England. For 3 years the commissioners quarreled at Paris over these conflicting claims, but the dispute was irreconcilable. The only arbitrament possible was by the sword. Meanwhile, both sides were preparing to occupy and hold the contested fields. New France already had a weak chain of waterside forts and commercial stations, the rendezvous of priests, fur traders, travelers, and friendly Indians, extending with long intervening stretches of savage-haunted wilderness through the heart of the continent, chiefly on the shores of the Great Lakes and the banks of the principal river highways, from Lower Canada to her outlying post of New Orleans. Around each of these frontier forts was a scattered farming community, the holdings being narrow fields reaching far back into the country from the waterfront, with the neat log cabins of the inhabitants nestled in close neighborhood upon the banks. In the summer the men, aided by their large families, tilled the ribbon-like patches in a desultory fashion, and in the winter assisted the fur traders as oarsmen and pack-carriers. Many were married to squaws, and the younger portion of the population was to a large extent half-breed. They were a happy, contented people without ambition beyond the day's enjoyment, combining with the light-heartedness of the French the improvidence of the savage. From 1700 on, the conflict seemed inevitable. The French realized that they could not keep up connection between New Orleans and their settlements on the St. Lawrence, if not permitted to hold the valley of the Ohio. Governor La Jonquière 1749 to 1752, understood the situation and pleaded for the shipment of 10,000 French peasants to settle the region, but the government at Paris was just then as indifferent to New France as was King George to his colonies, and the settlers were not sent. 114. Effect of French colonization. Of the region in which were scattered the permanent French settlements, the southern shore of the Great Lakes and the Mississippi Valley eventually became a part of the United States. Although these settlements were few and small, the influence of French operations in the West on the development of the English colonies was far-reaching. New France will always be renowned for the immense area held by a small European population. She was from the first hampered by serious drawbacks: centralization, paternalism, official corruption, instability of system, religious exclusiveness, the fascination of the fur trade, a deadly Indian foe, and an inhospitable climate, the sum of which was in the end to destroy her. She expanded with mushroom growth, but was predestined to collapse. Yet more than any other part of North America, the French colonies in what is now Canada preserved the language and the customs of the time of their settlement. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Epochs of American History, The Colonists, 1492 to 1750, by Reuben Thwaites. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Colonization of Georgia, 1732 to 1755. 115. References. See text. 116. Settlement of Georgia, 1732 to 1735. The southern boundary of South Carolina was practically the Savannah River, but the English claimed as far south as the St. Johns. Just below the St. Johns, and 170 miles south of the Savannah, lay the old Spanish colony of St. Augustine, founded in 1565. The country between the Savannah and the St. Johns was a part of the old Carolina claim, but when the Carolinas became royal provinces, the king reserved this unsettled district as crown lands. James Oglethorpe had been an army officer. He was a member of Parliament and was prominent in various efforts at domestic reform, particularly in the improvement of the condition of debtors' prisons. Stirred by the terrible revelations of his inquiry, he engaged other wealthy and benevolent men with him and formed a company, 1732, for the settlement of the reserved Carolina tract, which was to be styled Georgia in honor of the King George II. The proposed colony was to serve the double purpose of checking the threatened Spanish advance upon the southern colonies in America and of furnishing a home for members of the debtor class who would be given a chance to retrieve their fortunes by a fresh start in life. This scheme, half philanthropic and half military, had also in view the extension of the English fur traffic among the Cherokees, whose trade was now being eagerly sought by the Spanish on the south and the French on the west. The company was given a charter under the name of the Trustees for establishing the colony of Georgia in America, its land grant extending from the Savannah to the Altamaha. There were 21 trustees with full powers of management. They were to appoint the governor and other officials during the first 4 years. After that, the Crown was to appoint. No member of the company was to hold any salaried colonial office. Never was a colony founded upon motives more disinterested. It was to be literally an asylum for the oppressed. The settlers themselves were not given any political privileges, for it was thought the trustees would be better managers than a class of people who had not heretofore proved their capacity for business affairs. Slavery was prohibited because it would interfere with free white labor, and a slave population might prove dangerous in case of a frontier war with the Spanish. That immigration might be encouraged, and thus that the colony might be strong from a military point of view, it was ordered that no one should own over 500 acres of land. It was also ordained that all foreigners should have equal rights with Englishmen, that there was to be complete religious toleration except for Roman Catholics, that none but settlers of steady habits should be admitted, that no rum should be imported, and that the colonists were to practice military drill. In November 1732, Oglethorpe, appointed governor and general without pay, set out from England with 35 selected families, and in February 1733 founded the city of Savannah on a bluff overlooking Savannah River, some 10 miles from the sea. In May he made a firm alliance with the neighboring Creeks, whom he treated with great consideration. The second year, 1734, there arrived a number of German Protestants, persecuted exiles from Salzburg, who had been invited to America by the English Society for propagating the gospel. The Salzburgers proved a desirable acquisition, setting a much-needed example of industry and thrift. The Germans settled the town of Ebenezer. In the same year, Augusta was planted 230 miles up the Savannah River as a fortified trading outpost in the Indian country, while 2 years later, 1736, another armed colony was sent to found Frederica at the mouth of the Altamaha on the Spanish frontier. Augusta, which in 1741 numbered but 47 permanent inhabitants, in addition to a small garrison, was the chief seat of the Georgia and South Carolina fur traffic. It was the eastern key to the Creek, Chickasaw, and Cherokee hunting grounds. In 1741, it was estimated that about 125 white men, traders, pack horsemen, servants, and townsmen, depended for their livelihood upon the traffic centering at the Augusta station. Another estimate made in the same year placed the number of horses engaged at 500 and the annual value of skins at 50,000 pounds. The profits were great and would have been larger but for sharp competition in the faraway camps of the barbarians. There the Georgians and the Carolinians met Frenchmen who had wandered from far Louisiana by devious ways, part water and part land, and Virginians who found their way to the southwest through the parallel valley system, thus escaping the necessity of climbing the mountain wall. 117. Slow development of Georgia, 1735 to 1755. The trustees perceived at last that men who had failed at home were not likely to be successful as colonists, and they sent over a party of Scotch Highlanders and yet more German Protestants. The colony now proved a success. Savannah was well built, courts were established, the land system was well arranged, and Salzburgers, Moravians, and Highlanders soon came out in considerable numbers, 1735 to 1736. Yet there was no lack of discontent. The very class for whom the colony was founded formed its most undesirable inhabitants. Hardly a regulation originally established for their supposed benefit was to their taste. Idle and worthless fellows were numerous, and some of them, finding their complaints unheeded, fled to the Carolinas or to join the rough borderers. Among the settlers were 3 enthusiastic sectaries: Charles Wesley, secretary to Oglethorpe, his brother John, a missionary to the Indians, and George Whitefield, who succeeded the latter after he returned to England. Whitefield in later years deeply stirred the American colonists from Florida to New England in his efforts to arouse in them a strong religious conviction. In 1736, Oglethorpe made an expedition to the south as far as the English claim extended and planted several forts. At the same time he made a treaty with the Chickasaws and thus strengthened the southern line. 3 years later, 1739, war broke out between Spain and England. Fearing that he might not be able to withstand an attack from the Spaniards, Oglethorpe took the offensive, 1740, and marching into Florida, planted himself before St. Augustine, which had a garrison of 2,000 men, well supplied with artillery. Troops from Carolina soon came up, sickness breaking out in the camp, and many of the Carolinians deserting. The siege, which had been gallantly conducted, was at last abandoned. Up to this time the Spaniards had been obliged to stand on the defensive. Cuba was threatened by a large English squadron, but the attack there proved a failure, and opportunity was given for concentrating Spanish troops in Florida. In 1742 a heavy assault by land and sea was made on Frederica By a combination of bravery and superior stratagem, Oglethorpe succeeded in holding the place until the enemy's fleet was frightened off by the arrival of English vessels, and Georgia was henceforth free from Spanish invasion. Oglethorpe returned to England the following year, 1743, never to return to the colony. The trustees now placed the government in charge of a president and 4 assistants, but after the departure of its gallant and public-spirited founder, the colony no longer flourished, and in a vain attempt to remove causes for dissatisfaction, the company made matters worse. Slavery was introduced 1749, free traffic in rum was permitted, and restrictions on the acquisition of land were removed. Discontent grew apace among the original settlers, who were always hard to suit. Only the Highlanders and Germans remained satisfied. In 1752 the charter was surrendered by the disappointed proprietors, and Georgia became a royal province, with a government similar to that of South Carolina. The change wrought improvement in many ways. Georgia was the last of the 13 colonies to be founded, and remained one of the weakest until long after the Revolution. Its history is a proof that the robust growth of a colony depends not upon the character and aims of its founders, but upon the slow accretion of public sentiment and public spirit. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Epochs of American History, The Colonists, 1492 to 1750, by Reuben Thwaites. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Continental Colonies from 1700 to 1750. 118 references. See text. 119. Population 1700 to 1750. Up to 1700, the history of each colony is the history of a unit. The impulse of colonization came in successive waves, but each little commonwealth had its own interests, its own struggles, and looked forward to its own future. From 1700 to 1750, though the separate life and history of each colony continued, there were perceptible certain great phases of common development, which will be briefly outlined. Although disturbed by wars with the French and Indians, by domestic political quarrels, and by disputes with the mother country regarding the regulation of commerce and manufactures, there was a steady growth of population in British North America during the first half of the 17th century. The rewards of industry were sufficient, coupled with considerable religious and political freedom, to entice a continuous, though fluctuating, immigration from England and the continent of Europe. In New England, where the English stock was practically unmixed with foreign blood, the rate of progress was less pronounced than in Pennsylvania and the South, which were largely recruited from other races. In 1700, the population of New England was something over 105,000. By the beginning of the French and Indian War, 1754, it was a little less than 400,000, New Hampshire having 40,000, Massachusetts and Maine 200,000, Rhode Island 40,000, and Connecticut 110,000. The middle colonies commenced the century with 59,000, but by 1750 this had, chiefly owing to the exceptionally rapid growth of Pennsylvania after 1730, increased to 355,000, of which New York contained 90,000, New Jersey 80,000, and Pennsylvania and Delaware 100,000 and 85,000. In the southern group there was a population of 89,000 in 1700, which had grown to 625,000 in 1763, not counting Georgia, settled in 1733, which in 20 years had acquired a population of 5,000. Maryland had 154,000, chiefly Englishmen, but there was a liberal admixture of Germans and people of other nationalities. Virginia had nearly 300,000, of whom the blacks were now in the majority. North Carolina, important in numbers only, had 90,000, of whom 20% were slaves. South Carolina had 80,000, the blacks outnumbering the whites by 2 or 3 to 1. The total for the 13 colonies in 1750 is about 1,370,000. 120. Attacks on the charters, 1701 to 1749. For many years the New England charters were in imminent danger of annulment, the purpose apparently being to place the colonies under a vice-regal government. Those of Connecticut and Rhode Island were the liberal documents granted to them early in their career. Electing their own governors, they were practically independent of the mother country, and the general movement against the charters had these two especially in view. From 1701 to 1749, the charters were seriously menaced at various times, but on each occasion the astute diplomacy of the colonial agents in England succeeded in warding off the threatened attack. Worthy of especial mention in this connection are Sir Henry Ashurst, the representative of Connecticut, and Jeremiah Dummer, his successor. In 1715, at a time when it was proposed to annex Rhode Island and Connecticut to the uncharted royal province of New Hampshire, Dummer issued his now famous Defense of the American Charters, in which he forcibly argued, 1. That the colonies have a good and undoubted right to their respective charters, inasmuch as they had been irrevocably granted by the sovereign as premiums for services to be performed. 2. That these governments have by no misbehavior forfeited their charters and were in no danger of becoming formidable to the mother land. 3. That to repeal the charters would endanger colonial prosperity, and whatever injures the trade of the plantations must in proportion affect Great Britain, the source and center of their commerce. 4. That the charters should be proceeded against in lower courts of justice, not in Parliament. Dummer's presentment of the case was regarded by the friends of the colonies as unanswerable, and was largely instrumental in causing an ultimate abandonment of the ministerial attack on the New England charters. In 1728, as a consequence of popular disturbances in the Carolinas, a writ of quo warranto was issued against the charter, and the proprietors sold their interest to the crown. A royal governor was now sent out to each province. Heretofore, North Carolina had been nominally ruled by a deputy serving under the South Carolina governor. 121. Settlement and boundaries, 1700 to 1750. Boundary disputes were a constant source of intercolonial irritation. There were long and vexatious boundary wrangles between Connecticut and her neighbors Rhode Island, New York, and Massachusetts. In 1683, an agreement reached between Connecticut and New York was the basis of the present line, surveyed in 1878 to 1879. It was 1826 before the final survey between Connecticut and Massachusetts. The quarrel between Connecticut and Rhode Island was protracted and heated, the line between them not being definitively established until 1840. Wentworth, the first royal governor of New Hampshire, 1740 to 1767, made large land grants which overlapped territory claimed by New York, and thus brought on a protracted boundary controversy between those two provinces. Patents covering both sides of Lake Champlain were alike issued by New York and New Hampshire. The settlers east of the lake organized in revolt under the cognomen of Green Mountain Boys, and were preparing to set up a government of their own when the Revolution broke out, and in 1777 the unacknowledged government of Vermont was formed. A settlement of the boundary was not reached until Vermont was admitted to the Union, 1791. The boundary disputes of New York with Massachusetts and Connecticut were settled prior to the Revolution. In 1737, a boundary commission adopted the present line between Massachusetts and New Hampshire. The same commission established the present western boundary of Maine. In a contest between Massachusetts and Rhode Island, the former claimed a portion of the latter's territory on the ground that it was included in the Old Plymouth patent. But in the final settlement, Rhode Island retained possession. The Penn and Baltimore families long wrangled over the boundaries between Pennsylvania and Maryland. An agreement was reached in 1732 and ratified by a convention in 1760. Under its terms, Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon, two eminent London mathematicians, ran the famous Mason and Dixon line, 1767, separating the southern colonies from the northern. The boundary line between the Carolinas was not defined until 1735 to 1746. To the north and west, English boundary disputes with the French led to protracted and harassing wars, while to the south Georgia's claims clashed with those of the Spaniards in Florida, and during the war between Spain and England, occasion was taken by Oglethorpe, 1740, governor of Georgia, to invade Spanish territory. No man in this time was more energetic in pushing the confines of settlement and encouraging development than Governor Spotswood of Virginia, 1710 to 1722. A stalwart soldier who had fought under Marlborough. He built iron furnaces, introduced German vine growers, made peace with the Indians, and established several excellent mission schools for them upon the frontier. Under his administration, the fur trade spread far inland, and he did much to extend topographical knowledge of Virginia by fostering exploration. The Shenandoah Valley, opened to settlement by Spotswood, became, after 1730, a notable home for Scotch-Irish Presbyterians, driven by English persecution from their home in Ulster. They were by this time coming over to America in two steady streams, one pouring in at Philadelphia and the other at Charleston, South Carolina. Those arriving at Philadelphia pushed westward to the mountains, and drifting southwestward through the long parallel valleys of the Allegheny Range, met in the Shenandoah and kindred valleys those of their brethren who had gone up into the hills of Carolina. It was from these frontier valley homes that the migration into Kentucky and Tennessee proceeded a generation later, led by such daring spirits as Boone, Sevier, and Robertson. 122 schemes of colonial union, 1690 to 1754. Schemes for a union of the colonies to provide for the common defense and settle intercolonial differences were numerous enough after the example set by the New England Confederacy. They emanated almost entirely, however, from the government party, and chiefly for this reason were regarded with popular suspicion. In 1690, a Continental Congress had been held at New York for the purpose of treating with the Iroquois against the common enemy, New France. In 1697, William Penn laid before the Board of Trade a plan providing for a high commissioner appointed by the king to preside over a council composed of 2 delegates from each province and to act as commander-in-chief in times of war. The scheme aroused much opposition from colonial pamphleteers and failed of adoption. Other plans which were promulgated from time to time for the next 60 years were in the main adaptations of Penn's, some of them providing for 2 or 3 strongly centralized provinces, each to be presided over by a viceroy assisted by a council of colonial delegates. While the Board of Trade, distracted by doubts whether the colonies could be more firmly held as separate governments or under a vice-regal union, was engaged in considering the various propositions submitted to it, several neighborhood congresses were held by the provinces themselves, chiefly to treat with Indians or for purposes of defense. But these congresses were in no sense popular meetings. They were composed of the official class, and had little more effect on the people than to accustom them to the spectacle of colonial union for matters of common interest. In 1754, the Lords of Trade recommended a second General Congress of the colonies to treat with the Iroquois again. They also favored articles of union and confederation with each other for the mutual defense of His Majesty's subjects and interests in North America, as well as in time of peace as war. The Congress was held at Albany. Only 7 of the colonies were represented: New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. The convention adopted a plan of union prepared by Franklin, providing for a general government that should be self-sustaining and control federal affairs, war, Indians, and public lands, while the colonial governments were to retain their constitutions intact. The plan was rejected by the colonial assemblies. Franklin himself wrote, "The Crown disapproved it as having too much weight in the democratic part of the Constitution, and every assembly as having allowed too much to prerogative." The defeat of the Albany Plan marks the end of efforts at union on the part of the official class. The next movement came from the people themselves as the result of oppression on the part of the mother country. 123 quarrels with royal governors. 1700 to 1750. The history of the English continental colonies during the first half of the 17th century was largely made up of petty bickerings between the popular assemblies and the royal governors. The salary question was the most prominent feature of these disputes. Acting under orders from the Crown, the governor in each colony insisted on being paid a regular salary at stated intervals, but the assembly, as persistently refused and desiring to keep him dependent upon them, voted from time to time such sums as they chose. The principle at stake was important. A fixed salary grant would have been in the nature of a tax imposed by the Crown. Had the Assembly been complacent, the government would have been thrown into the hands of the royal governor and council through their absolute power to veto laws. The acrimonious contention was greatly disturbing to all material interests, but it served as a most valuable constitutional training school for the Revolution. At times in Boston, excitement over this perennial quarrel ran to a high pitch, and now and then it looked as though the Assembly would be obliged to yield. But the men of Massachusetts were of stubborn clay, and never displayed more bravery than when the governor, backed by writs from England, threatened them the loudest. In 1728 the Assembly defended itself, saying it was the undoubted right of all Englishmen by Magna Carta to raise and dispose of money for the public service of their own free accord, without compulsion. The Privy Council at last yielded the point, 1735, and left the Massachusetts governor free to receive whatever the Assembly chose to grant. In some of the colonies this salary question resulted in frequent deadlocks, in which all public business was at a standstill. 124 governors of southern colonies. Other differences between the governors and their assemblies hinged on claims of prerogative, fees for issuing land titles, issues of paper money, official attempts to favor the Church of England at the expense of dissenters, and levies of men and money for the public defense. There were also special grievances in many of the provinces. In South Carolina, 1704 to 1706, the proprietors attempted to exclude all but Church of England men from the Assembly. This led to a bitter controversy in which the dissenters successfully appealed to the House of Lords, and legal proceedings were commenced by the Crown for the revocation of the Carolina Charter. But they were not then pushed to an issue. In 1719, the meddlesome executive policy of the proprietors resulted in a popular uprising in which the governor was deposed. Later, the authorities, 1754 to 1765, attempted to resist the issue of paper money and also to reduce representation in the Assembly, while at the same time the home government introduced some offensive regulations regarding land patents. Popular indignation again expressed itself in bloody turbulence, and the colony fell into great disorder. In North Carolina, the scattered colonists maintained a vigorous resistance to arbitrary authority. The tone of official life was low. Corruption in office was common. Contests over questions of public policy often led to rioting and anarchy. Bloodshed was not infrequent in such times of popular disturbance. In the far western valleys there was for a long period no pretense of law or order, and criminals of every sort found a safe refuge there. While pirates, until Blackbeard's capture by Governor Spotswood of Virginia in 1718, freely used the deep coast inlets as snug harbors from which they darted out with rakish craft to attack passing merchant vessels. From 1704 to 1711 there was practically no government in the province, owing to an insurrection headed by Thomas Carey, whom Governor Spotswood finally arrested 1710 and sent prisoner to England. During the administration of Governor Nicholson, 1698 to 1705, the Virginia Assembly had quietly gained control of the financial machinery by making the treasurer an officer of its own appointment. When, therefore, the customary 18th-century wrangling commenced, the Assembly was master of the situation. The burgesses refused to vote money for public defense until the governors yielded their claims of prerogative and land title fees. 125 governors of middle colonies. Nowhere was the weary disagreement between governor and assembly so harmful to provincial interests as in Pennsylvania. There were elements in the contention there not existing elsewhere. The Penn family, as the proprietors, resisted the proposed inclusion of their lands in tax levies for the conduct of military operations, while the Assembly for many years would vote no money for such purposes or pay the governor's salary, except on the condition that the proprietary estates paid their share in the cost of defense. The proprietors finally yielded 1759. Other points of difference were the assertion of the gubernatorial prerogative of establishing courts and proprietary opposition to the reckless issues of paper money frequently ordered by the Assembly. The Quakers were opposed to warfare on principle. They would neither take up arms themselves in defense of the borderers from the French and Indians, nor except when driven to it in times of great distress, vote money to equip or pay volunteers. They had, too, a great objection to levying and paying taxes, and in this they found strong allies in the Germans, who had now come over in large numbers, chiefly to settle on wild lands in the interior of the province. Most of the Germans and Quakers would go to almost any length to compromise with the Indian and French invaders who were mercilessly destroying the pioneer settlements. The proprietors and their governors fretted and threatened. The English government sent over order after order to the stubborn legislators. The borderers plied the deputies with heartrending appeals for aid, yet the Assembly long maintained its obstinate course, now and then grudgingly voting insufficient issues of depreciated bills of credit. Lord Cornbury, who succeeded the Earl of Bellamont as governor of New York and New Jersey 1702, was not a man to inspire respect, being profligate and overbearing. He opposed popular interests, winning especial hatred through its petty persecution of dissenters from the Church of England. He was recalled in 1708 in response to general denunciation of his course. His successors were in continuous and often acrimonious controversy with their assemblies, but generally succeeded in inducing the deputies to contribute with more or less liberality to the conduct of expeditions against the French and Indians. Governor Belcher of New Jersey, 1748 to 1757, who had been worsted in a heated salary contest in Massachusetts, 1730 to 1741, and had profited by experience, was now one of the few executives who understood how to handle an assembly. By an obliging temper, he readily secured the passage of such revenue bills as were essential to the proper defense of the colony in the French and Indian War, and avoided serious dispute. 126 governors of New England colonies. The brief term of Sir William Phips, 1692 to 1695, as governor of Massachusetts, a province then extending all the way from Rhode Island to New Brunswick, with the exception of New Hampshire, was filled with bitterness and disappointment. At the outset of his career and the inauguration of the new charter, the Assembly, in the absence of any provision under that head, enacted that taxes were only to be levied in the province with the consent of the Assembly. Had this rule been accepted by the Crown, it would have left little occasion for quarrels between governor and people. Its rejection by the home government left the door open to a train of events which ended 84 years later in continental independence. The witchcraft delusion had stirred the colony to its center, and Phips gained no friends from his attitude in that affair. He angered Boston and crippled its political influence by securing the passage of a law, 1694, that deputies to the Assembly must be residents of the district they represented, and his temper was so testy that at the time of his recall he was engaged in a quarrel with nearly every leading man in the province. The Earl of Bellamont came over in 1698 as governor of New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. In November, the General Court of Massachusetts invited him to visit Boston so soon as the season of the year might comfortably admit his undertaking so long and difficult a journey. In the following spring, 1699, he responded to the call. In Massachusetts, Belmont won favor by siding, as he had in New York, with the popular party and recommending to his government the introduction of many reforms. In Rhode Island, where he tarried by the way, he found much to dissatisfy him, and reported the people as being ignorant, in a state of political and moral disorder, with an indifferent set of public officials who were corrupt and abetted the pirates who swarmed in Narragansett Bay. Bellamont promptly devoted himself to the suppression of these sea robbers, and in the year of his own death, 1701, brought the notorious Kidd to the gallows. Bellomont's conciliatory attitude towards Massachusetts did not please the English Board of Trade, which sent him warning that the colonists had a thirst for independency, as was particularly exemplified in their denial of appeals. Connecticut and Rhode Island were left with their old charters and their popularly elected governors, and thus were happily spared those quarrels over salaries, prerogatives, and fees which elsewhere in the colonies aroused so much ill feeling. Governor Fletcher of New York was commissioned to take military control of Connecticut. He went to Hartford to assert his right, but meeting with rude treatment felt impelled to return home, and little more was heard from him. Like Massachusetts, Connecticut was successful in preventing legal appeals to England. In New Hampshire, which was separated from Massachusetts in 1741 and became a royal province, there had been more than a century of dispute between the settlers and the proprietors respecting the Mason claim, and much confusion had at times arisen. The matter was at last ended by the purchase of the claim by a land company, 1749, which released all of the settled tracts. 127. Effect of the French Wars, 1700 to 1750. The aggressions of the French and their policy of inciting the northern and western Indians to murderous attacks on the slowly advancing English frontier kept the colonies which abutted on New France in an almost constant state of excitement. Those provinces which had no Indian frontiers, such as Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, and Rhode Island, and the Carolinas, which latter had, however, several desperate local Indian uprisings to quell, experienced but little alarm over the common danger, viewed schemes of union with indifference, and contributed but grudgingly to the funds and expeditions for general defense. Pennsylvania was open to attack along an extended border, the Germans and Quakers being opposed to making war on Indians. Her frontier suffered greatly from frequent raids of the enemy. New York, being on the highway between the Atlantic coast and the Great Lakes in Canada, was the scene of many bloody encounters. No other province was so greatly exposed, and on none did the cost of the prolonged and desperate contest between the French and English in America so heavily fall. In 1706, during Queen Anne's War, 1702 to 1713, the French made an unavailing attack on Charleston, South Carolina. In the capture of Port Royal, 1710, New England men chiefly participated, and they were otherwise prominent throughout the war. In King George's War, 1744 to 1748, New Englanders alone took part, although New York and a few other colonies contributed to the army chest. Louisburg was captured in 1745 by New England troops, who were highly elated at their brilliant conquest. England, too busy with her own affairs, could not well send protection the following year when a French fleet threatened New England. A curious chapter of marine disasters alone saved the Americans from being severely punished in retaliation. This doubtless unavoidable neglect on the part of the mother country and the final surrender of Louisburg to the French by the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, 1748, tended still further to strain the relations between England and her colonies on the American continent. Admiral Vernon's expedition against the French in the West Indies in 1740 was participated in by men from nearly all the English colonies, island and continental. A campaign against the Spanish settlements in Florida was undertaken by Oglethorpe during the same year. The Carolinas gave somewhat tardy aid to Georgia in this daring enterprise. 128. Economic conditions. Massachusetts was the first of the colonies to issue paper money. This was in 1690 to aid in fitting out an expedition against Canada. The other provinces followed at intervals. Affairs had come to such a pass by 1748 that the price in paper of £100 in coin ranged all the way from £1,100 in New England to £180 in Pennsylvania. The royal governors in all the colonies, acting under instruction from home, were generally persistent opponents of this financial expedient. Governor Belcher of Massachusetts, in a proclamation against the practice, 1740, said it gave great interruption and brought confusion into trade and business, and reflected great dishonor on His Majesty's government here. In 1720, Parliament passed what was known as the Bubble Act. designed to break up all private banking companies in the United Kingdom, chartered for the issue of circulating notes. This act was made applicable to the colonies in 1740 and reinforced in 1751, the last named act forbidding the further issue of colonial paper money except in cases of invasion or for the annual current expenses of the government, these exceptional cases to be under control of the Crown. In 1763, all issues to date were declared void, although 10 years later, 1773, provincial bills of credit were made receivable as legal tender at the treasuries of the colonies emitting them. The controversy between the colonies and the home government over these issues of a cheap circulating medium developed much bitterness on the part of the former, who deemed the practice essential to their prosperity, and it was one of the many causes of the Revolution. Another constant source of irritation were the parliamentary acts of navigation and trade. In the continental colonies there was no popular sentiment against smuggling or other interference with the operation of these obnoxious laws. In no colony were the acts strictly observed. Had they been enforced, they would have worked unbearable hardship. Massachusetts particularly offended the Board of Trade by openly refusing to provide for their more rigorous execution, coupling its stubborn behavior with the bold assertion, quite contrary to ministerial ideas, that the colonists were as much Englishmen as those in England, and had a right, therefore, to all the privileges which the people of England enjoyed. 129. Political and social conditions, 1700 to 1750. In the colonies, as afterwards in the States, there was a continual contest for supremacy between Virginia, where political power was lodged in the aristocratic class, and New England, where there was a voluntary recognition of aristocracy, but where the body of the people ruled. Virginia ideas strongly influenced North Carolina on the south, and Maryland, Delaware, and Pennsylvania on the north. The tone of life in South Carolina was purely Southern, with no trace of Virginian characteristics. New York, also free from Virginian methods, was strongly influenced by New England ideas. The governing class in Virginia were of strong English stock, and when occasion for political action offered, were ready for it, proving themselves good soldiers and statesmen, and furnishing some of the most powerful leaders in the revolt against the mother country. Their protracted fights with the French and Indians inured them to habits of the camp, while quarrels with their governors and bickerings with the home government over the navigation acts and the impressment of seamen furnished schooling in constitutional agitation. By the middle of the 18th century, the majority of Virginians were natives of the soil, and their attachment to England was weaker than that of their fathers, while the considerable foreign element weakened the bond of union with the mother country. In Maryland, general hostility to the Church of England and its impolitic attempt to suppress dissent was an important factor in widening the breach. North Carolina continued to be distinguished for disorder and a low state of morals, education, and wealth, and produced no great leaders in the opposition to Great Britain. The people, having a keen perception of their rights, were eager enough in the patriot cause, but there was a large Tory party, and consequently fierce internal dissensions characterized the history of the colony throughout the revolutionary agitation. Being dependent on England for trade and supplies, the aristocratic planters of South Carolina were drawn much closer to the mother country than in any other continental colony. The Tory element was powerful, yet the best and strongest men of the slave-holding class were patriots and furnished several popular leaders of ability, the colony ranking second only to Virginia in the southern group during the struggle with the home government. Georgia was but newly settled, and the English colonists were still strongly attached to their native country. She was therefore more loyal than her neighbors. The settlers from New England, with the political shrewdness peculiar to their section, succeeded in committing Georgia to the patriot cause. But the mass of the people remained lukewarm, and when English rule was overturned, there was much lawlessness. The community was immature and had not yet learned the art of self-government. The navigation acts and the impressment of seamen bore hard on Pennsylvania, and there was no lack of complaint against other forms of ministerial interference with colonial rights. But the Quakers, who were chiefly of the shopkeeping and trading class, had not experienced the long and painful struggle for existence that had been the lot of most of the other colonists. They had been prosperous from the beginning, and being conservative, timid, and slow in disposition and action, were not easily persuaded to make material sacrifices for the sake of political sentiment. Thus Pennsylvania was an uncertain factor in the revolt. New Jersey, with no Indian frontier, no foreign trade, and but light taxes, had few causes for complaint against England. Her rulers were thrifty conservative farmers, who were disposed to be loyal. Yet, as they were of pure English descent and tenacious of their liberties, they were gradually drawn into an attitude of opposition to English rule. New York was the only one of the middle group of colonies which stood stoutly against England. Since the days of Andros, the people caught at everything to lessen the prerogative. New York City, as the second commercial port on the coast, was naturally a seat of opposition to the navigation laws. But the Tory minority were nowhere more active or determined than in New York. The New Englanders were pure in race, simple and frugal in habit, enterprising, vigorous, intelligent, and with a high average of education. They were small freeholders possessed of a democratic system which had powers of indefinite expansion, and were trained in a political school well calculated to produce great popular leaders. Their political principles, developed by a century and a half of contention with the home government, pervaded the colonial revolt and were carried out in the national government in which it resulted. The New England Confederation of 1643 bore fruit in the Stamp Act Congress of 1765, and still more in the Confederation of 1781 and the Constitution of 1787. 130 results of the half-century 1700 to 1750. Although the period 1700 to 1750 has not the interest of the previous half-century of colonization, it has great constitutional importance. The rugged individuality of the founders of the colonies, New England, Middle, and Southern, was beginning to give way to a distinctly American character. The colonies lived separate lives. There was little intercommunication, but their interests were much the same. Their relations with the mother country were the same, and in the intercolonial wars they learned to act side by side. More than this, they all enjoyed a greater degree of personal freedom and local independence than was known anywhere else in the world. They had no consciousness of any desire to become independent. They had their own assemblies, made their own laws, and disregarded the acts of trade. In population, the colonies decreased between 1650 and 1700 from about 100,000 to 250,000. During the period 1700 to 1750, they grew to 1,370,000. A few passable towns were built: Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. Their means were small, their horizon narrow, but their spirit was large. As the year of 1750 approached, there came upon the colonies two changes destined to lead to a new political life. In the first place, the colonies at last began to overrun the mountain barrier which had hemmed them in on the west, and thus to invite another and more desperate struggle with the French. The first settlement made west of the mountains was on a branch of the Kanawha, 1748. In the same season, several adventurous Virginians hunted and made land claims in Kentucky and Tennessee. Before the close of the following year, 1749, there had been formed the Ohio Company, composed of wealthy Virginians, among whom were two brothers of Washington. King George granted the company 500,000 acres, on which they were to plant 100 families and build and maintain a fort. The first attempt to explore the region of the Ohio brought the English and the French traders into conflict, and troops were not long in following on both sides. At the same time, the home government was awakening to the fact that the colonies were not under strict control. In 1750, the administration began to consider means of stopping unlawful trade. Before the plan could be perfected, the French and Indian War broke out in 1754. The story of that war and of the consequences of simultaneously dispossessing the French enemies of the colonies and tightening the reins of government belongs to the next volume of the series, The Formation of the Union. End of chapter 14. End of Epochs of American History, The Colonists, 1492 to 1750, by Reuben Thwaites.